Hello, I'm Ann Prather, creator and developer of Fasting, a Contemporary Journey. In the process of creating this seminar, I've been asked a number of questions. The first one is, do I have to fast to fully participate in Lent? The answer is unequivocally no. God is waiting to hear whatever conversation you wish to have with Him about self-examination, learning, and listening. The second question people have asked me is fasting all about food? The answer to that one is yes. In part one of this seminar, I'll show you how fasting fits into God's overall ordained scheme for protecting us and guiding us to a healthy relationship between food, Himself, and our bodies, minds, and spirits. And the third question that I get asked is, I have health concerns. Can I fast? The answer to this is a reserved yes. In part 2 and 3 of the seminar, I'll introduce you to a wide spectrum of fasting pattern and practice. In all of these combinations, you should be able to find one that you have access to. And now, Fasting, a Contemporary Journey, Part 1. Hello and welcome to Part 1 of Fasting, a Contemporary Journey. The Conversation Disrupted. Because we're going to be talking about conversations, I want to just bring to your attention 3 vocabulary words for this set of slides. These are words that are important in our discussion today, and so I want you to listen for them, and then I want you to go home and write down 15 associations for each of them. Write as quickly as you can. Be unself-conscious. It doesn't matter if you repeat. It doesn't matter if the associations don't make sense. It only matters that you write them as fast as you can. Do it a couple of times. What you're going to find is that you have some unexpected associations with these words, and you'll also discover that these associations have patterns. So the words are discipline, conversation, and practice. I'd like to start this presentation with the story of how I met my first M&M. I was about 2.5 years old at the time, and my parents lived in one of these neighborhoods that grow up around military bases, full of young men with young wives and young kids. And the young wives often liked to do the same thing on the same day, which meant that hiring babysitters became problematic, and even more so if one of the children involved was blind, as I was. So my mom hired a woman who came highly recommended by our church, whose name was Mrs. Jose. And Mrs. Jose had the figure of an NFL linebacker and a voice to match. And she came in, and at the top of this substantial voice, "Oh, what a beautiful child, that silver hair, so pretty." And I thought she was going to crawl down my throat, because of course to a blind child, well, loudness is closeness. My mom and Mrs. Jose went on full tantrum alert about the point that they realized I was terrified, and Mrs. Jose came up with a solution. My mom held me in her arms, and Mrs. Jose knelt down so she was on my level and began to talk to me very softly, and she fed me M&Ms. And the taste of those M&Ms, I remember to this day. It was like everything you can imagine in a beautiful Hawaiian day. Flowers and the smell of green plants, the smell of coconut and mango and chocolate, and you name it. It was just this overwhelming taste. Now, the neuroscientists probably have all kinds of explanations for what happened to me at that moment, but what I noticed was that my conversation with food had deteriorated to me and chocolate. If I was looking at a plate of pizza, I wanted chocolate. When I was in 3rd grade, I went to a convent school, which had its main meal at noon, and I couldn't eat much because I wasn't used to a big meal at noon. so I didn't clean my plate, and thus they denied me dessert. At some point, that denial became so painful that I screamed, and I got punished, and my mother stomped into the office and said, "You will serve my daughter smaller portions, and you will not deny her dessert if she asks for it." There's a beautiful promise God makes in Luke. We often couch this one in socioeconomic terms. It's, "Blessed are those who hunger now, for they shall be satisfied." As I got further and further away from my first M&M, I became more and more aware that other people heard a conversation I simply couldn't hear. I've drawn this conversation in a triangle that shows bidirectional information flow from God to food, from food to me, and from me to God. It seemed to me that I was supposed to get information from my food that I just wasn't getting. Likewise, God was talking to the food and the food talking back in a way that, as a plant geneticist, I kind of understood, but I had no idea how it was relating to me and food. And then there was me and God. In that conversation between me and the M&M, God was nowhere in that picture. So there are two beginning signals for a conversation. Think of beginning signals like this. "Hi, Rod, how are you?" And Rod responds, "I'm fine, how are you?" These two signals are hunger and appetite. Hunger is the feeling that your stomach is empty, and it's the one that you can stop by tightening your belt, because if you make the space in the stomach smaller, that sensation of hunger will go away. By contrast, appetite is the desire for food, and even more, the desire for a particular kind of food. Its evil twin is craving. Likewise, there are two signals for the end of a conversation. You can think of the end of a conversation, "Well, Rod, I guess it's time to go." And Rod says, "Yep, I'll see you later." Like that. Okay, these two signals are satiety. Satiety is the cessation of desire for food. It's kind of strange. If that switch fires well, you can be sitting there and looking at a scrumptious plate, and when you've had enough, you've had enough. And fullness is the physical side of satiety. It's the sensation that the stomach is distended. And it's the thing that you get changed in bariatric surgery. Your stomach is smaller, so you get full more quickly, and thus you consume less. Now, we've been talking about your body's speaking to you. What we now need to consider is how food speaks to your body. So these are the inputs to the conversation. The first of these is taste. There are 6 of them, and each one of them has a different story to tell. So the first one is sweetness. That's the taste of pure energy. If you crave sweets, the chances are your body thinks it needs energy. The second one is salt. Salt is the taste of electrolytes. Electrolytes are nutrients that participate in everything from keeping your heart beating to the synthesis of nucleic acids. Finally, there's bitterness. Bitterness is the taste of bases. It's fairly common in vegetables. The next one is sour. Sour is the taste of things that are acidic. If you eat grapefruit, that's a highly acidic fruit and it tastes a little bit sour. Umami is an interesting one. Umami is the taste of savory protein. And if you take the foods that are on the list of umami foods and you put them in a nutrient database, you will discover that the nutrients they are high in are a who's who list of cell rebuilding. And finally, there's fat. Fat is the other taste of energy. And one mostly senses the taste of fat as the blending of flavors that fat promotes. But it does have a taste all its own. The other sense that we have that's very closely connected with taste is smell, which we think of as flavor. Now, smell is fascinating. We can actually distinguish 10,000 odors, and we can even distinguish molecules that are identical except for their orientation. So lemon and lime, the smell of those two, that molecule, those are identical molecules except that one rotates to the left and the other rotates to the right, and our noses can tell the difference. So our little noses are actually quite the chemical detectives. In addition to taste and smell, eyesight and touch play an important part in the way we perceive food. Eyesight is interesting because it turns out that foods that are naturally brightly colored are also almost invariably high in critical nutrients. If a root vegetable is orange, it's likely to be high in vitamin A. Dark red, it's high in antioxidants. Saturated green, high in a number of other nutrients, including magnesium. So it's no wonder that we have come to evolutionary age looking at these foods with desire. And finally, texture and mouthfeel. Food companies spend a lot of time on this, and they do so because it's important. People's swallowing reflex, many of them, is determined by texture. Some of us swallow in response to taste, but texture is the more common one. And so we now begin to see where we get the inputs and outputs to the conversation between us and food. Our body lets us know when we're hungry and what kind of food we need, lets us know when we're sated and when we're full. Our food, in return, sends back the information about what it is through our senses. Now, here's an interesting thing. This conversation can be disrupted at all points. The conversation between God and our food can be disrupted by things like agricultural manipulation, bad weather, which can alter the nutrient content of food, processing, which can change the nutrient content of food. There are plenty of ways in which that can be disrupted. The conversation between food and ourselves, body, mind, and spirit, can be disrupted if, for example, we get an emotional jolt associated with a particular high sugar, high theobromine food, say M&Ms. And if these two lines get disrupted, it's really easy to lose God out of the picture, as you saw in my earlier slide. So what are we going to do to solve this problem? As with everything that God does, there's a relational solution. And in fact, God established in the Bible 3 disciplines which are designed to help us maintain that lovely conversation between us and food and God. These disciplines are diets, feasting, and fasting. And so because we want to put fasting into its proper context, I'm going to spend a little bit of time here going over the other 2 because they're interesting. So in Exodus 15, verse 26, God makes a fascinating promise. He essentially says that, look, if you obey my voice and listen to my commandments, I will relieve you from the diseases of the nations. That's a health promise. And he's making this promise to 600,000 people who were on a camping trip in the wilderness. They don't know about germ theory. They're not scientists. In the Bible, God sets up dietary restrictions. And here are 2 of the famous ones. If you don't eat pork, you won't get trichinosis. Now today, of course, we know how to handle pork properly. But they didn't back then. And so they just didn't eat it, and that protected them. Likewise, if you don't eat shellfish, you won't get toxins from the red tide. Interestingly enough, these diets were necessary and sufficient to allow the children of Israel to be protected from these hazards. We have a number of diets in contemporary times that are like this. People born with celiac disease, if they keep a diet free of oats, rye, and wheat, they will essentially avoid the damage from the disease. Likewise, there are two errors of protein metabolism, phenylketonuria or PKU, and the other is glutaric aciduria or GA1. If you keep its diet, you'll be protected from cerebral palsy. If you keep the PKU diet, you'll be protected from mental retardation. These diets are necessary and sufficient to prevent damage from the disease. So here are some characteristics that distinguish diets. Diets are usually prescribed for some kind of health or life improvement outcome. Diets often have complicated rules. I know people who keep diets on a spreadsheet, and there are apps out there and information sites out there for diets. It's astonishing what you can find. And finally, diets have no beginning and end. They're often lifelong. This is a stark contrast to the other two disciplines. So diets you can think of as kind of the backbone way of guiding our relationship with food and the relationship between food and God and ourselves. So let's look at feasting and fasting. Feasting is the ceremonial consumption of abundant food. This can happen at the harvest time, and it can be, it often is a stretcher for your taste buds because you eat foods that you don't eat at any other time of the year. A feast properly prepared is a hugely disciplined affair where you eat little bits of many courses. By contrast, fasting is the ordered temporary abstinence from some or all food, and it's a solitary discipline. Feasting is a corporate discipline. And diets, let's be clear here, diets are cultural and social as well as individual. Here's a picture of a typical feast. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. How many of you out there watching this have holiday foods that you can't stand? I mean, in my family, the holiday food that was to be dreaded was fruitcake. My grandmother would spend a whole day on this dreadful concoction, and we all had to eat it, because if we didn't, it would hurt her feelings. On the other hand, fruitcake taught us to be aware of fermented fruit and nuts in a kind of prune-tasting background. Okay, that adds to your taste buds vocabulary. That's the point of feasting. The other point of feasting is that it sometimes adds a narrative to your abundance. So in the case of the Passover feast, the Seder meal, there's a whole story that's told in the food served at that feast. I don't eat walnuts at any other time of the year, but if I'm at a Seder meal, I will eat the charosis. So in the Bible, there are 3 stories of what I call the Jesus fast. So now we're to fasting. This is the point of this whole wonderful thing. And the stories tell slightly different things, but they're very detailed in what actually happened during that fast. Let me be clear here. Everybody in the Bible fasted. Everybody knew how to do it. Nobody had to be taught. It just was a part of life. However, the Bible took great care with this one story. And thus we have, preserved for us by God's Word, a model system for a fasting practice. So let me tell you the story of the Jesus fast. This is my somewhat crude graphical representation. He gets baptized in the Jordan, and the dove comes down and says, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And so several hundred witnesses now know that this guy is probably more than a carpenter's son. And he then gets driven out into the wilderness by the Spirit, and it's interesting to me that they don't say which one, to fast and be tempted. Now, I am a practitioner, or was a practitioner, of extended fasting. I think the longest I ever went was 21 days, but I kind of have a sense of how these fasts go. So he would be tempted during the first 7 days. He'd be hungry. He'd want food. But he'd keep on keeping on, because that's what he felt called of God to do. So he burns off his carbohydrate stores during those 7 days, and now his body undergoes a massive switch. It's like a monumental changing of the guard. And he begins to burn off his fat stores. And he burns off his fat stores and burns off his fat stores until at the end of 40 days, he is hungry. Some translations say famished. He's essentially starving. He's burned off everything he has. And in walks Satan. And the first thing Satan says to him is, "Hey, you think you're so great. Turn that stone into bread and eat it. I dare ya." Now, I remind you, Jesus is an experienced fasting practitioner, and he knows something that all of us who keep extended fasts have to learn, which is that fast has to be broken. And I would not eat that bread on a bet that close to the end of a 40-day fast. There is an art to breaking these long fasts. It doesn't apply to the shorter ones so much, but there is an art to breaking these long fasts, and Jesus had had no chance to participate in that art before Satan started in. So Jesus is starving, but he knows to his bones that he doesn't dare eat the bread that Satan is asking him to turn that stone into. And so he says, "We do not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." Now, notice he refers to that conversation again. We live by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. We listen to God. And in his moment of starvation and ultimate temptation, that's what he calls on. And then in the end, the angels minister to him, and all of my extended fasting practitioner buds say the same thing. Yeah, the angels ministered to him. They went and found him some decent breaking foods and helped him get out of that long fast. Now, from this story, we learn that fasting has a structure. And that structure consists of 4 phases or stages. Initiation. This is externally derived, and for a really rewarding spiritual practice of fasting, you want to keep it that way. It can be externally derived because it's a medical fast. It can be externally derived because you've gotten out the book of lesser feasts and fasts and figured out if there is one that starts the day you're working on. Or it can be externally derived because you just have an intention you'd like to declare. But the initiation of a fast, for the purposes of my sort of practice, should be externally determined. Once you initiate, you have a maintenance phase. In the case of this maintenance phase, it has a rule. The rule for this one was no food for 40 days. And the length of that maintenance phase was 40 days. So maintenance is the body of the fast. It's the part where you keep whatever rule you've set. And after maintenance comes breaking. If you're on a fast like the Jesus fast, it will take you half the length of it to break it. The 21-day fast that I went through, it took me 11 and a half days to break and be able to resume normal eating. When you resume normal eating, that's the termination of the fast. Now, I want you to notice something here, and that is that we have a model. And notice that I have put in a bunch of different times for this maintenance phase. In this system, following these stages, all fasts are created equal. You practice at the level of which your body is capable. Just like a musician does not start off playing, for example, the Revolutionary Etude if you're a pianist, or the Andante Largo if you're a guitarist. You don't start off playing difficult stuff. You start off with really simple, gentle stuff, but you follow a structure. That's the way music is practiced, and this is the way we practice fasting. So you can have a maintenance phase that's basically any length you want. And so we come back to the purposes of fasting and what they are in biblical times versus what they are now. So in biblical times, you would see fasting imposing a sacred narrative on the reality of food scarcity. Now we're talking here food scarcity that is countrywide. It's really very abundant, it's evident, and it affects all socioeconomic classes. This is why everybody in the Bible fasted. Fasting is an adjunct to prayer, and fasting can be an expression of emotion or penitence. Those were the three things that people did with fasting in the Bible. And now for us, fasting is training for all kinds of eventualities. How many of you have been in the hospital and gotten a pre-op instruction that says no eating or drinking for 12 hours before surgery? Then you go in for surgery and the operation lasts 16 hours. Well, now that's a 28-hour fast that's been imposed on you by the medical establishment, and you can treat it as a fast. You can take initiation as a prayer for your surgery and healing. The maintenance rule is easy, no food or drink. The time is determined by your surgeon and the schedule of your surgery. And you will come out of it, and they will give you chipped ice, which you can learn to recognize as a breaking food. So that training phase, imposing a narrative on necessary food withdrawal, is the same as it would be, but for different reasons, for biblical people. And thus, this is essentially the same purpose. And now we return to our conversational triangle. Once again, we see the bidirectional information flow between God and food, between food and us, and between us and God. Fasting is one way in which we can restore this conversation. Ironically, simply because we abstain from food, we become more aware of the conversation between ourselves and God, and ironically, the conversation between ourselves and the food that isn't there. Especially if we're doing shorter fasts, this is the case. And then when we come out of the fast, we're prepared to listen to God and to our food and to ourselves. Our vocabulary words again. And you see where they have been used and how they have been handled in the slideshow, and that will influence your associations some. But if you're like a lot of us, if you do those 15 associations quickly, you'll find that you get a combination of new and old associations. And finally, here are some questions for discussion. What does it mean to offer your life as a holy and living sacrifice to God? And the second question is, how does food relate to being a holy and living sacrifice to God? And this is an interesting one to think about. Does food relate because you feel that if you don't eat certain things, other people will have them? Or does it relate because you feel that controlling your intake of food will restore your conversation with God and with food? There are all kinds of answers to this question. And finally, there is um, the question of, has the idea of sacrifice gone wrong in this century? You've been watching Fasting, A Contemporary Journey, Part 1, A Conversation Disrupted by Ann Prather. If you'd like more information about our show and upcoming presentations, please visit us at annprather.com. We hope you've enjoyed this presentation. Thank you for joining me for Fasting, A Contemporary Journey, Part 1. In Part 2, we'll continue our exploration of the conversation between God and food and our bodies, minds, and spirits.